So I'm pleased to introduce to you our first speaker, David Graizbord, is a historian of early modern and modern Jews. To date, his research has focused mostly on the Western Sephardim diaspora of the 17th century. In particular, his writing approaches questions of religious, social, and political identity as these questions shape the lives of so-called new Christians or conversos from the Iberian Peninsula who became Jews in exile. He has also written about Judeophobia and the culture of the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, ethnicity and religion among Sephardim from medieval times to the 1700s, and conversal trading networks in the Atlantic. He teaches courses on Jewish civilization, medieval and early modern Jewish history, modern Jewish history, Jewish mysticism, and the Spanish Inquisition. Will you please welcome him?
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Director. Thank you all for being here this bright and early. It's a pleasure to be here in Santa Fe. What you see behind you here is a reproduction of photographic reproduction of an illustration that appears in a medieval Haggadah. A Haggadah is a booklet, essentially, that contains the Passover liturgy. This is, I think, one of the few instances of an illustration that is produced by Jews, and it actually depicts Jews from medieval Iberia. These Jews are my topic for this morning. Now, I should mention before I delve into my paper that when Professor Star-Lebeau and I were comparing notes briefly before the conference, we decided to align our talks more closely than we had originally intended with our respective areas of expertise. So today we'll be focusing primarily on Jewish culture within the Iberian Peninsula, and she will be looking at inquisitorial culture much more thoroughly than I will. There will be some overlap, no doubt, but I hope that this approach will be stimulating. In order to confine my remarks to about 40-45 minutes, I've cut out and chopped out a number of things that I could expand upon. So if you have any questions, any concerns, curiosity, toward the very end, I have also carved out about 15 minutes for us to discuss your questions. So, so again, thank you. Questions of identity has been at the center of the history, the phenomenology, and the historiography of Iberian Jews and new Christians since the Middle Ages. We can trace these questions back through the fateful period 1391 to 1415. Within that time span, a third to two-thirds of the Jewish population of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon converted to Christianity, mostly under duress. This watershed suscitated what the historian David Nuremberg has aptly characterized as, quote, a profound social and cultural crisis of classification, end quote. In 1497, with the vertiginous creation of an entire class of Cristãos Novos, new Christians, a similar crisis visited the kingdom of Portugal as well. To discuss the crisis, which I call really a cluster of crises of identity, not just of classification. To discuss the crisis, let me begin by underscoring something very basic that I feel scholars of Iberian history too often overlook. Whether they lived under Muslim or Christian rule, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula were the inheritors and the practitioners of a full-fledged civilization. As I will explain in a moment, that civilization was not a religion. And please notice when I do this a lot, right? Don't be distracted. So Jews did not comprise a religion, at least not in a Christian sense of the term. Furthermore, the cultural system of the Jews was not called Judaism. They did not call it Judaism, and this is a system system that was not deeply analogous, therefore, to Christianity. So today I'm interested in briefly discussing certain shifts in Iberian Jewish imagination and discourse that took shape in the wake of the mass conversions. The shifts were sometimes subtle, sometimes they were accretive, sometimes they were subtle. In any case, they resulted in Jews' changed assumptions about the nature and the meaning of Jewish identity. Specifically, what I'm going to do is provide a few snapshots of the process by which non-Jewish concepts of faith and theology as religious markers of Jewish identity became significant to Iberian Jews after 1391. That is to say, after the mass conversions and the subsequent identity crisis. As scholars of the ancient world know, Judaism is not a Jewish term. It's a Greek term, Judaismos. The word itself emerged from within a Hellenic cultural matrix to designate the laws and the customs of the people of the Israelite state of Judah. For that people, however, there was no Jewish religion in the Western sense of a systematic, much less creedal theology with associated rituals of God worship. Pre-modern Jewish culture was never anchored in private conviction. By the same token, belief was never the sine qua non, the prerequisite, if you will, of identity of community, as it was and it still is, I believe, for Christians. It's very telling that the pre-modern Hebrew language, the one that you find in the Hebrew Bible, in core rabbinic sources and so forth, this language had no word for religion. It had no word for prayer. And yet it included many terms that designated what the Greeks themselves recognized as the Judean ethnos, right? The ethnic group. Terms like Beit Yaakov, house of Jacob, Bnei Israel, children of Israel, Goy Kadosh, holy nation, and so forth. In the ancient and medieval worlds, Judeans were characterized principally by their way of life. Judeans lived as they did, not because they had evaluated as in some kind of laboratory all available ways of life and determined that theirs was the most cogent, the most truthful, the most aesthetically appealing, the most spiritually uplifting, or philosophically elegant. Judeans behaved as they did simply because they were Judeans, and they perceived their distinctive way of life to be their ancestral inheritance. In the traditional terms of the writers and editors of the Hebrew Bible, Judean culture had originated in the commands of a national God. That deity had freed the Israelites and had forged a covenant with them as the extended family, and I emphasize the word family, of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. That is to say, as an ethnic collectivity. At the foot of Mount Sinai, the children of Israel, including, of course, those of the tribe of Judah, had promised to observe, not to believe in or to assess the validity of the terms of that covenant. In the famous words of Exodus chapter 24, verse 7, Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will listen. To be sure, Judeans' lives entail behaviors and concepts that modern social science would classify as religious, in the sense that they expressed an idealized relationship between humans and the transcendent. They sought to enact that relationship, and they conveyed an understanding of the proper order of the universe. Nonetheless, ancient and medieval Judeans, or Jews, did not distinguish between the realms of religion and the secular, as distinct from, let's say, the holy and the profane. Right? So too, Judeans did not distinguish between socioeconomic and political life on one hand, and theology and worship on the other. Indeed, the perceived coextension of kinship, politics, economy, theology, cosmology, worship, law, and social customs was part and parcel of many ancient traditional cultures, not just the Judean. And here I think, of course, of various Native American countries that are here, that surround us. Arguably, the understanding of religion as an essentially confessional matter of private conscience and theological argumentation would not become refined in the West until the Protestant Catholic Reformations. All right, so what am I saying? The generations of Judean sages who lived during and after the Roman destruction of the Judean state created what non-Jews and modern secularized Jews have come to know as rabbinic Judaism. The sages, though, did not approach being Judean as a matter of spirituality, of upholding religious obligations. Indeed, these men were not engaged in the construction of anything they called a Jewish religion, much less Judaism. Classic rabbinic texts present a host of theological ideas, but they formulate no systematic theology. To this day, incidentally, there's no such thing as Jewish religious dogma. Classical rabbinic ethics assign a positive value to the concept of emunah, which can be translated as loyalty or trust. Still, they stress neither fealty nor persuasion as somehow necessary to acquire and to maintain Israelite identity per se. It's important to note in this connection that rabbinic norms concerning religious conversion, quote unquote, are in fact nothing of the kind. They are rather procedures for giyur. Giyur is a Hebrew noun denoting a process of adoption, or to borrow a modern term, of naturalization. Giyur is a process whereby non-Judeans are integrated with the Jewish nation, the extended Jewish family, and are re-socialized as Jews, specifically as gerim, right? As those strangers who dwell among Jews. Notably, rabbinic texts that our friends here would have read, would have heard, generally don't speak of the Jews, Chai Yehudim, right? But rather they speak of the collective Israel. That, by the way, is the proper noun, the proper name of the Jewish people, Israel, not Jews. That collective Israel is always presented as an am, right? As a nation whose redemption would be communal and would occur in history, in the world, not in some ethereal, timeless realm. Because Jewish tradition has it that the Torah, that's to say God's teaching, was revealed to the entire Israelite community at Sinai, divine guidance is traditionally assumed to be self-evident, public, and collective, not private, not individual, not a matter of persuasion or intellectual argumentation. What I'm saying is that all pre-modern Jews, and hence Iberian Jews of the medieval centuries, at base did not constitute a community of faith. Rather, they were a historical kin community of fate with a very distinctive culture. Again, they were the inheritors of an all-encompassing national way of life. By contrast, the conceptual organization of reality into two realms, the abstract and the concrete, in Aristotelian terms, form and matter. This division, this organization was basically foreign to the way of life of the Jews. Greek philosophical dualism did, of course, influence the Jews of antiquity in the Middle Ages, but pagan Hellenism never overthrew the monistic assumptions of rabbinic discourse, which, of course, had become normative among Jews in medieval Iberia. Crucially, for purposes of our discussion today, Hellenic dualism became a primary shaping component of Christianity, and therefore of some faithful Christian misunderstandings of Jews. By the period of the identity crises that interests us here, entire Christian civilizations had developed in accordance with this dualistic worldview. Christian social institutions assumed a sharp contrast between the secular and the religious, or as Jesus and his disciples have reportedly put it, between the world and heaven, between Caesar and God, body and spirit. Jews were central to this imaginary system. In that system, they played two roles. First, that of tolerated inferiors who were nonetheless integral parts of the economic and social life of Christians. This according to the writing of Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine. The second role that Jews played was that of symbols of carnality. And therefore, they were often demonized, persecuted, humiliated. At any rate, Jews imputed blindness allegiance to the spiritual message of Christ and their alleged obstinacy in continuing to live in accordance with their supposedly earthbound character became axioms of Christian theology. Jews and Judaism were correspondingly central to the self-definition of Christianity. Right? Jews as real people, but also, and I think more importantly, as figural entities, as imaginary creatures. Now let me turn to the Iberian identity crisis in earnest. From 1391 to 1415, the Hispano-Christian crusade against Judaism led to the near destruction of Castilian and Aragonese kehilot. Kehilot is a plural of the term kehilah, which is Hebrew for a community, a holy community, one that's configured according to halakha, namely Jewish law. This crusade also led to the concomitant problem of Judeo-conversos, as we will hear throughout this conference. The outlines of the story are very well known. By the end of the Tortosa Disputation of 1415, kind of pageant in which Christian friars publicly denounced Judaism and sought to convert Jewish audiences, by the end of this disputation, a majority or a large minority of Castilian and Aragonese Jews had become titular Christians. Irrespective of their Christian sincerity or lack thereof, in many, if not most cases, the converts and their immediate baptized descendants still lived among Jews or lived relatively close to Jews, and therefore they had extensive social and economic and familial relations with people who had not converted. This meant that for the first time, at least the first time in Iberian Jewish history, since the persecution of the Almohads, the religion and the ethnicity of tens of thousands of people, once known, still widely regarded as Jews, were at odds. New Christians were, quote unquote, Jewish as concerned their ancestry, their social and economic relations, their ethnic culture and background, and their social reputation. And yet, their religious identity was at least theoretically the same as that of the majority population. And by the way, members of that majority started to call themselves old Christians, cristianos viejos, in order to distinguish between themselves and the converts' descendants. So the massive scale of this phenomenon obligated rabbis, clergymen, and local and crown officials to struggle like never before to disentangle the Jews from the former Jews, both conceptually and in practical terms. In effect, the authorities had to redefine the meaning of Jewishness and Christianness given the ambiguities in the social status and behavior of the Judeo-conversos. Two questions delineated this challenge. Number one, were these new Christians, cristianos nuevos, still Jews? Number two, if so, of what did their Jewishness consist? Canon law provided reasonably clear answers to these questions. Popes and bishops and their lawyers had it that a Christian was simply a person whose baptism was valid in the eyes of the church. In case you're wondering, in 1478, Pope Sixtus IV legitimated the mass conversions of Iberian Jews as, quote, not absolutely forced, end quote. Now, for its part, rabbinic law had it that Jews who joined a non-Jewish community, de jure or de facto, were nothing more than sinning Jews. In other words, they were still an integral part of the community of Israel, Knesset Israel or Kehilat Israel. Now, at first, Jewish communal leaders in Iberia upheld this basic legal standard of genealogical Jewishness, if you want to call it that. And this was true notwithstanding the fact that there were differences among the various decisors prior to, say, the 1440s. By the way, let me draw an aside and say that the Jews never had anything resembling a pope. So you can wander from rabbi to rabbi and get different opinions, and you can really follow whatever you want. This allows for tremendous flexibility that I think has been integral to the survival of Jewish life in the broad diaspora. As a joke, though, for every 5 Jews, there are at least 7 opinions. So let me give you an example of how the genealogical Jewishness principle is upheld. Rabbi Saadia ben Maimon ibn Danan, from Muslim Granada, maintained that Judeo-conversos, quote, "Achenu bli safek." They are our brethren without a doubt. Still, the complexity and the fluidity of the new social and cultural landscape in the Crimes of Castile and Aragon eventually generated doubts that checkmated any hard and fast legal definitions of Jewish identity. For example, Iberian rabbis faced an acute legal dilemma of having to determine the fate of wives or husbands whose spouses had converted to Christianity before undergoing rabbinic divorces. The status of the women was especially difficult to negotiate. Were these women free to remarry? If so, were they obligated to marry the brothers of their of their now Christian husbands, according to the laws of levirate marriage? What if the brother of a converted husband had undergone baptism himself, and therefore couldn't or wouldn't perform the chalitza, namely the ritual for releasing the woman from the levirate union? Such vexing juridical problems were part of a larger reality whereby Jews who had undergone baptism were still vitally connected to their Jewish relatives, even participating in Jewish weddings, circumcision ceremonies, and the like. According to a famous opinion of Maimonides, such converted individuals were to be regarded as anusim. That's a Hebrew term that means coerced ones, and therefore as essentially blameless Jews. Time passed, okay? So the original converts and their descendants in the Iberian realms became partially or fully integrated with the larger Christian community of faith. In fact, the center of gravity of Jewish life, openly Jewish life in Castile and Aragon, shifted to rural areas, largely as a result of segregationist legislation. In addition, you can't forget this, of course, from 1480 to about 1530, inquisitorial tribunals succeeded in violently suppressing real and alleged Judaizing among new Christians. Judaizing is a term of art. It means basically anything that the church deems to be Jewish in terms of behavior and thought, but which may or may not actually be Jewish in any objective sense. The bottom line is that most of the practices of fraternization between Jews and new Christians that had once alarmed various observers subsided, right? But this wasn't the end of the story. New complications arose. New problems of defining Jewishness came to the foreground. These problems acquired, I think, an unprecedented social force. Already at the beginning of the 15th century, for example, Iberian and North African rabbis were receiving news from travelers or from their own congregants regarding Jews who had accepted baptism under duress in Spain or Portugal, yet were now behaving as disciplined Christians without ambiguity. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say Portugal, I meant Spain. So these subjects had accepted baptism under duress, that they were now behaving as disciplined Christians without the slightest ambiguity, without the slightest remorse, even if they still maintained some contact with their Jewish relatives, that is to say, with their unconverted relatives. To complicate matters, a few Judeo-conversos who had never lived as Jews, in other words, who had been born into baptized families and had been baptized as infants themselves, were taking refuge in Muslim domains, probably because of some form of persecution, and they wished to, quote-unquote, return to the cultural identity of their Jewish forebears. So the questions arose. How should openly professing Jews in places like Fez or Istanbul, how should openly professing Jews relate to all of these culturally liminal individuals? Were the baptized subjects classifiable as innocent, coerced Jews, as anusim, or as meshumadim, destroyed ones, that is to say, criminals who willingly violate Jewish law? Alternately, here we get into the plethora of Jewish legal definitions, should the violators be categorized as minim, that is to say, as rebellious kinds or genres, that is, as criminals who dare not detach themselves from the community of Israel completely and openly, but who think and act in ways that are inimical to the Jewish community and to its normative way of life. And what about the baptized children of the converts, of the original converts? What about the subsequent descendants of the converts? Did these descendants fit the legal definition of a tinok shenishba? That is to say, were they legally categorizable as Jewish infants who had been captured by Gentiles and therefore raised without an awareness of their Jewish obligations? Else, were the subjects, these descendants of converts, evil sinners because their immediate ancestors had once lived as Jews? In other words, they hadn't been kidnapped by Gentiles. They had been taken into Christianity by their parents, grandparents, and so forth. Were the so-called returnees, these refugees, these returnees to the God of Israel, were they to be treated as Gentiles altogether? In other words, when people jumped the fence from, let's say, from Castile to Portugal, where up to 1497 there was an open Jewish life, were the refugees to be treated like Gentiles who wanted to become Jews, or as Jews who were somehow returning to the fold? Jewish responses to these legal conundra varied, yet they all had the effect of subtly recasting the comprehensive civilization of an Oriental people as a narrowly defined Western religion in the Christian mold, albeit a religion with a distinct and potentially destabilizing ethnic component. Of particular interest in this connection is the promulgation as early as 1436 of private and municipal statutes of limpieza de sangre, cleanness of blood. The concept of limpieza formally reframed and stigmatized Jewishness as a matter of descent, virtually irrespective of a person's official religious status, that person's demonstrable belief, and his or her observable behavior. So, equipped with this, if you will, weaponized notion of casta y generación, right, caste and origin, anti-Jewish ideologues and other bigots began to treat questions of morality and religious fealty as matters of familial heredity. Now here's the interesting piece. For their part, Castilian and Aragonese Jews acquired a correspondingly acute consciousness of their own genealogy. And this they echoed some of their ancestors' earlier fixation with the allegedly noble Judean pedigree of the Jewish community of Al-Andalus under the Umayyad caliphs. El-Azhar Goodworth, an Israeli scholar, has found evidence of a new genealogical turn in Jewish letters of introduction from the late 1300s and early 1400s. These letters differ from older ones because they, the new letters, explicitly distinguish between good Jewish families, that is to say, families whose members hadn't converted, and, on the other hand, families allegedly or actually sullied by some kind of Christianization. A faithful message of these new letters was the very un-rabbinic notion, if you will, that while individuals may share Jewish descent, their different fealty to God rendered them essentially separate groups altogether. Now, there are other rhetorical devices that emerged for underscoring Jewish physical heredity and reimagining it in very unprecedented ways. For example, some Jewish propagandists argued, get this, that Iberian Jews descended from Israelites who had settled in Iberia in the days of King Solomon, so the apocryphal story goes. And that therefore, the Jews of Hispania could not have been complicit in the death of Jesus of Nazareth. They weren't there. Right? This historical device, of course, was a means to avoid confronting the canard of deicide. And this device even supported, I would say, the accusation of deicide by assigning blame for it to non-Iberian Jews. Needless to say, this was a blatant and extraordinary breach of intra-Jewish national solidarity. And of course, it also implied a very bizarre acceptance of a very old and very familiar bloodline. If you say that you weren't there for the crucifixion, and you say that the other Jews did it, well, that means that you think it happened just as the Christian theologians described it, and all that. So it's interesting. It's a paradox, right? But the highly charged environment of religious propaganda that preceded and accompanied the mass conversions to which I referred earlier, and by the way, continued until the final expulsions of 1492 to 1498, pulled some Jewish discourse and identity in a decidedly non-genealogical direction as well. whether for purposes of debate or out of genuine conviction or both. Various Iberian rabbis tacitly adopted the Christian definition of the Jewish way of life as a faith that was founded on theological propositions and was therefore analogous to Christianity. A new language, in fact, a new diction of Jewish religion. In Hebrew, the word is dat. Right? This language made its appearance in legal, homiletical, and philosophical literature. For example, in the mid-15th century, a philosopher by the name of Yosef ben Shem Tov characterized rationalist philosophers within the Jewish fold as people who, quote, did not consider religion at all worthy, end quote. Lo yechashev dat ve'eineihem. Here the biblical sense of the word dat, which is decree, nothing to do with religion, right? This biblical sense seems to me to become subsumed under a different, a more, if you will, Christian understanding. So dat, the term dat becomes shorthand for the conjoined concepts of theological orthodoxy and discipline in worship, exactly what the polemicists argue that the Jewish philosophers were against or were avoiding. These self-same rabbis and some of their correspondents went so far as to tacitly redefine the Jewish status of individuals strictly on the grounds of behavior and putative belief. That is to say, the jurists downplayed or seriously qualified the older, dominant rabbinic principle that once a Jew, always a Jew, regardless of sin and of inner persuasion. That's a very famous concept in the Talmud, later used by the Ashkenazi Rabbi Rashi. Af al pi shechata Yisrael hu. Even though he has sinned, he's still Israel. Evidence of this shift that I'm talking about includes several legal cases in which both petitioners and respondents explore the possibility that remorseless conversos have actually nullified their identity as members of the Jewish people. They have abandoned, quote, our religion, dateinu is the term of art, and are now goyim gumurim, complete Gentiles. To give you but one example, Rabbi Yaakov Berab, native of Castile, issued a ruling in the early 1500s when he was already in Morocco, strongly suggesting that any Judeo-conversos found in Iberian Christian realms were complete Gentiles by definition, because they practiced a foreign cult, and unlike him, they had not escaped to a free land when they had a chance. Notably, Rabbi Berab intended this particular ruling to apply even to those new Christians who avoided sexual contact with Christians of non-Jewish origin. So here again, the notion that Jewishness is something transmitted by physical descent, particularly by matrilineal descent, goes out the window as a measure of cultural integrity. We also see subtle rhetorical turns whereby Jewish polemicists convey that Jewish culture is a kind of ideological thesis, one that is defensible via rational argument or intuition, and in that sense a sort of inverted mirror image of Christianity. In this new scheme, Jewish culture ceased to be the self-evidently valid and exclusive way of life of a people per se. The new understanding was that Jewish faith did not follow solely from the prior existence of a nation that had been subject for centuries to a legal covenant with God, but rather that Jewish faith was based on the quote-unquote truth of Jewish belief. Right? Truth with a capital T. An example of this new approach comes from the Aragonese scholar Yehoshua Halorki. In 1400 or so, he wrote a letter of rebuke to his former teacher, one Rabbi Shlomo Halevi, who had by then become the prominent clergyman, Pablo de Santa Maria. So here is Halorki writing his letter of rebuke, and he's of course horrified that a learned man of Israel, like his teacher, has accepted a Christological reading of the Hebrew Bible. Halorki says, I'm filled with surging doubts and with horror. And yet, Halorki himself, I would argue, was closer to Christianity ideologically than he cared to admit. And we know this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that in the letter, Halorki concludes that his former master must have become convinced of the truth of Christianity particularly of the Christian claim that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, quote, and that all the prophecies that speak of the Messiah and the redemption fully conform with his particulars, that is to say, with his birth, death, and resurrection, end quote. In other words, Halorki, the student, calculated that the sagacious Halevi, the master, had become intellectually persuaded by Christian exegesis and Christian theology. Christian exegesis and theology were, of course, the foundations of anti-Jewish polemics. Halorki also posited that Halevi had rejected Jewish culture as intellectually deficient. Halorki, of course, saw his master's conclusion as an erroneous assessment of worth. But Halorki notices he does not contest the very untraditional notion, untraditional to Jews that is, that Jewish culture should be evaluated as a kind of philosophy. What I am saying is that Halorki does not treat the core intercommunal dispute between Jews and Christians in the Iberian Peninsula as a matter of comparing cultures that are inherently incomparable, right? Because one is dogmatic, one is based on belief, and the other one is based on ethnic factors. Another reason that we know Halorki was edging closer, if you will, to a Christian understanding of Judaism than he cared to admit, is a reason that Benjamin Gampel of the Jewish Theological Seminary has already noted. To wit, Halorki described his wayward teacher as a master of, quote, 2 Torahs, end quote. By this, Halorki, the pupil, did not mean the written Torah and the oral Torah, which, if you know anything about traditional Jewish culture, these are the two foundations, the two elements of the rabbinic canon. Written Torah being the Hebrew Bible, and the oral Torah being the major compendia of rabbinic opinions, the Mishnah, the Jerusalem Gemara, the Babylonian Gemara, and in fact all subsequent rabbinic opinions. So Halorki didn't mean the written Torah and the oral Torah. He meant the Torah of the Jews and the Torah of the Christians. Right? In a word, Halorki had internalized the standard Christian understanding of divine revelation, according to which God had given humanity 2 laws, the Old Testament and the New. And he was certainly not the only learned Iberian Jew who was making recourse to this particular understanding of 2 Torahs. I'll give you an example. In the 1370s, let's say about 30 years before Halorki wrote his letter, Moshe HaKohen of Tordesillas, who was the chief rabbi of Avila at the time, explained the following about a polemical book that he had written to argue against Christianity. כתבתי בו דברים כנגד אמונתם כדי להכחיש תורתם, והבאתי ראיות מעדותם החדשה לקיום תורתנו הקדושה. Why aren't you laughing? Just kidding. This is what he says. I wrote in it things against their faith in order to deny their Torah. And I brought evidence from their New Testament for the preservation of our Holy Torah. Alright, so you might say, what's the big deal? Okay, the word Torah, in its most immediate literal sense, means something like instruction. So by calling Christian tradition a Torah, Jewish polemicists like Halevi Tordesillas must have been merely referring to Christian teachings without giving them any kind of great status comparable to that of the Israelite Torah, the dual Torah that's both written and oral. Well, actually I doubt it. Why? Because for a learned medieval Jew to throw around the resonant word Torah, especially in a polemical setting, seems very rash, to say the least. But even if we accept the possibility that the Jewish writers, like HaKohen Tordesillas, were using words lightly and only for their descriptive value, my basic point, I think, is still made. The writers were analogizing. This was quite new. They were presenting Christianity and Judaism. And I use that word, Judaism, yes. They were presenting them as parallel, as 2 similar scriptural traditions, as 2 items of the same kind, if you will, 2 fruits from the same tree, belonging to 2 human groups of the same kind. This to me implied a radical internalization of the terms of Christian polemics against Judaism, Those polemics pitted two faith communities, one real, the Christian, and one figural, the Jewish, against each other. Here, the Iberian Jewish intellectuals seem to be close to accepting the imaginary faith-based identity that Christian scholastics had assigned to Jews, as well as some elements of Christian theology itself. To understand how deep this phenomenon went, let me remind us that in his letter to his former teacher, Yoshua Halorki made a reference to Jesus' resurrection. He didn't qualify. He didn't ridicule at all. In other words, it's as though he was tacitly assenting to the claim that Jesus had indeed conquered death. Very strange, from my standpoint. To sum up, Halorki, the student, implied that Jewish culture was founded upon an old revelation, a revelation threatened by the intellectual force and evident worldly success of a new and possibly true dispensation. To my mind, this tacit adoption of the premise represents a critical concession to what Jeremy Cohen, a scholar from Tel Aviv, has called medieval anti-Judaism. Once Halorki and other Iberian Jews assented to the Christian conception of quote-unquote Judaism as a theological and practical system that was analogous to Christianity and therefore subject to rational invalidation, a path lay open to internalizing very important Christian claims. First, that the truth of Christianity was predicated upon the falsehood of Judaism. In other words, that Jews had to be wrong in order for Christianity to be right. Number two, that Christianity was valid because God had chosen a new Israel, namely the Christians. And number three, that Christianity was valid because the formerly chosen people, the Israel after the flesh, the carnal Israel, had been left without divine protection. To put it very simply, Jews could look around them, they could survey the ruin of Jewish life in the Hispano-Christian realms in the, let's say, 1390s to the 1440s, and find in the zero-sum relationship between the old and the new religions a compelling description of reality. No appeal to Jews' collective memory, to their ancestral heritage, to their relationship with a national God, and to evidence of Jewish well-being outside of Castile and Aragon. None of these things could allay the apprehension that Hispano-Christian society was on the ascent, that Jewish society in the Iberian Peninsula had collapsed and was on its way to disappear. By the very terms of the debate that their Christian assailants had forced Jews to join, Judaism must therefore be invalid. Let me conclude by suggesting that when we consider the concept of fractured faiths that undergirds this exhibition, we are well advised not to assume what beleaguered Iberian Jews and conversos themselves came to assume after a century or so of pressure. Namely, that medieval and early modern Jews comprised a faith community that experienced a certain loss of faith from 1391 to 1415. I maintain at base that pre-modern Jews formed an ethnic national community, one that was compelled to fight for its life by redefining itself. Quite paradoxically, Iberian Jewish intellectuals accomplished this redefinition, and they did it in ways that made sense, not to the Jews as much as to their persecutors. Thank you. And now I open it to questions.
Yes, I finished reading the protocol again. No God, Jesus wasn't faith, and they spent a lot of time talking about their moms.
Hold the microphone to your chest.
I understand in the Muslim faith there's imams that sound a lot like rabbis, and it sounds like there's every assorted opinion. You can have this imam be a fundamentalist, this, a Sufi, so my question, I think my voice is louder than this thing. It's not?
I think
Okay.
the question.
Well, the question is, is the fact that there are imams and rabbis is because there's so much similarity between the two religions, and it's the thing that I got out of reading the book, No God But God, was that it makes it difficult for the Muslims to get together on anything because there's so many diversified opinions.
Okay, so the question, as I understand it, is: are there rabbis and imams because there are cultural similarities between Christians and Jews? I'd rather put it backwards. In other words, the fact that there are imams and rabbis whose social functions are similar is but a symptom of some underlying similarities. Did I just put it backwards or replicate the question? I don't know. But anyway, it's very interesting. Both Muslims and Jews have legal traditions. In the Islamic case, it's Sharia. Not Sharia law, as people say, that's redundant. Sharia is law. And then, of course, in the Jewish case, there's halakha, right? So nowadays, if you go to, let's say, your favorite synagogue in Santa Fe, particularly your Reformed temple, let's say, notice they don't use the word, they often don't use the word synagogue. You will find rabbis whose roles have evolved rather dramatically from the people, from the roles of the people that I've just described, right? A rabbi is fundamentally, traditionally, a legal scholar. He is a judge, he's a teacher, he's a communal head. He is not a PR specialist, and he's not a ritual specialist. He doesn't lead prayers. And by the way, we can talk about whether there's any such thing as Jewish prayer. Tefillah, which is a Hebrew term, doesn't really translate into prayer. It's a different story. And so I think this is true as well of some imams, right? They're primarily there to interpret law. They're like our federal judges, let's say. And what they generate, both imams and rabbis, is, at least traditionally, they generate legal opinions. And so when you research a case, you go and research the response of the rabbis and the edicts of the ulama, and you make a decision. Now, I dare say that there are very important differences. Islam developed as an imperialist system, it's an imperialist cultural system, and it posits that the world should be Muslim, the entirety of the world. Now, there are a couple of biblical prophets who sort of fantasize about the Jewish culture somehow, or the Judean culture being accepted by the world. But Judaism is primarily if you will, a parochial culture, right? It's for a particular people. Not that there was never any attempt to convert non-Jews, but those attempts subsided pretty early, and ultimately I think the foundation of Jewish culture is that, as I mentioned. Thank you for your question. Anything else?
Let me bring the microphone down to you, please.
Joseph, I'll let you decide.
You had a question. And it may help if you feel comfortable standing up. We might be able to hear you a little better in the back as well, if you feel comfortable doing it.
I'm curious about population, and if you have any sense of ratio of, what this population was within the larger Spanish population, and also what were they doing? What was the business and occupation and economy going on? If you have any insight to that, that'd be helpful.
Okay, great. No, very good questions. The first is, population. Jewish population in Iberia relative to general population and occupations. What was the occupational profile? I was afraid you'd ask me the first question. It's very fraught. Scholars don't agree because we lack any census data of the kind that we might generate today. Just to give you an example. Okay, so about, forget what it was, maybe like 1290 or so. There were 3,600, or was it 6,300? I don't remember. The taxable families, taxable Jewish families in Castile alone. This includes the Crown of Aragon, Navarre, Portugal. Okay, so I think, okay, so if you multiply by 4, right? Family being 4 people, then I think, what is a family? We have to consider the context. A family may mean a clan, an extended family. In other words, a whole host of dwellings surrounding a courtyard where aunts and uncles and grandpa and grandma, whatever, are all raising children collectively. And there are servants and there are business associates and so forth, people who are de facto align themselves with the clan. So how many people are we talking about? I don't really know. And I mean, you can read all kinds of speculations about this. Scholars make up their minds and then they argue for their numbers. I think we can talk about a couple of 100,000, maybe 200,000 in all, in the late or the middle 15th century. But that's very, very opaque. And furthermore, I think the most important aspect is what percentage of the urban population do Jews comprise? This leads me to your second question. In some places, it was as high as 20%, both in the Andalusian Muslim realm, in the subsequent statelets, Muslim statelets, and in the Christian realms. Yeah? That means that, in essence, as is true, I think, in modern times, Jews, so to speak, punched above their weight, right? Their impact on the, let's say, the official culture, the legal culture, the religious culture of the other, of the majority, was actually magnified by the fact that Jews were concentrated in cities, up to 20%, depending on the place. Now, having said that, I think it's one of the most interesting aspects of Sephardi life as it developed in the Middle Ages. Unlike, let's say, the Ashkenazi Jews, Iberian Jews were not, generally speaking, backed into undesirable occupations. Many of them, for example, had plantations. They grew olives, they grew pork, other things. Certainly processed wine, processed olive oil. Of course, there was a big artisanal component there. People who not only served the Jewish community by providing ritual objects and the like, but provided all kinds of goods and services in the cities and beyond. So we're talking about a relatively diverse population, which I think would actually have very faithful effects on the different trajectories of Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews on the other hand. Let me just note that Sephardi is a retrospective term. The Sephardic Jews didn't call themselves Sephardi in the Middle Ages. They started to call themselves Sephardi once they had been exiled. So for example, Maimonides was, I think, one of the first people who signed his name Hasfardi, right, the Sephardi, the Spaniard. That was rare. Eventually, the term became sort of an umbrella for Jews in places like Istanbul and throughout, the Near East, the Levant, I should say. Good questions, and I'm sorry I can't really be very, very specific about the population figures.
Can I just say one follow-up question?
Oh, let me bring you the microphone, please.
Okay, well, go ahead and say it, and I'll repeat it.
Was conversion, or was this somewhat of a social mobility move? A way of
Yeah, so was conversion a move to ascend socioeconomically? Well, I mean, in effect, if not by design, it certainly was, right? Because once you became at least technically Christianized, you didn't suffer the disabilities that Jews suffered. Now, I have to qualify, right? Because certain municipalities, and even I think certain crowns, made the decision that conversos, let's say the literal conversos, the ones who converted, had to pay the taxes that they had accrued as Jews, right? Their Jewish taxes. So this was a way, of course, of saying, well, you're not really Christian. You're not really the right kind of Christians. Look, I think it's a matter of consensus that Iberians were the victims of their own success. Various polemists struggled for centuries to agitate people so that they would force Jews to convert. Finally, boom, there you have a big population of conversos, and then they couldn't be digested, right? And so, yes, in many ways they ascended. They married into quote-unquote good families of old Christians. and in many cases disappeared into the Christian fold. In other cases, they couldn't escape their stigma and were treated as a different, even as a different ethnicity. So that by the time you have the emergence of a Judeo-Portuguese nation, you see that even though there were many disciplined Christians among the conversos, in this case the descendants of converts, there was still a sense of difference. Yeah? And at least a consciousness of having been descended from Jews. Yes.
What percentage of contemporary Spaniards are descended from these conversos?
What percentage of contemporary Spaniards are descended from conversos? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm an early modernist. Also, I mean, I don't know how you would measure such a thing. I mean, people may claim, but do they all have genealogical proof? And even if they have documents, are those documents creditable? I really don't know. I mean, a while ago I read a report in some newspaper to the effect that some large percentage of Englishmen descended from a particular king. Does that mean they're all conscious of it? Does that mean that they're all nobles or whatever? They all walk around wearing crowns? I don't know. I mean, it's just very, very tough to say. I do know that there are movements of people who feel, even if they don't have any evidence, that they are somehow descendants of Jews who have been violated, and they wish to come closer in some fashion to the Jewish community. That's, of course, all well and good, I suppose. I mean, I'm not a gatekeeper, so I'm not going to say they should or shouldn't.
Yes.
Well, one of the last studies they did, the DNA study, showed that in the last DNA study they showed in Spain, that was about 20% of DNA today among Spaniards can be traced back to recognizable haplogroups and people within that as well as genealogical studies.
Yeah.
And people go back now to the 1300s, you can find families genealogically.
Okay, did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
No. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. Studies, genealogical and genetic, show that 20%.
DNA 20%.
That DNA 20% descend from Jews, right? Now, here the question is, well, what does that tell us? Culture is not a genetic thing, right? So there's always the element of volition. If you listen, I'm Jewish. I'm a committed Jew. So let me take off my historic hat for a second. Okay? Now I'm not the neutral oracular presence that I was a few minutes ago. Okay, so I'm now speaking as a Jew. Okay, if you're crazy enough to want to be Jewish, because it's a tough thing. I say, wonderful, come and let's embrace. And if I wake up one morning and I think to myself, I am Chinese. Okay, and I learn Chinese, and I marry a Chinese woman, and I go to China for many years, whatever. That's all great, okay? We don't live in a world that's going to tell me, no, you're not Chinese. But at one point or another, the Chinese community is going to have to make a decision. Is this fellow Chinese? Okay, that is part of the volitional element to which I'm referring, right? So you may have Jewish ancestors. What you make of it, and what the Jewish community, which has a stake in things Jewish, does with that, is another story entirely.
Yes, I have a question. I have a question about, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for your definition of the Jewish community as it was defining itself in Spain in relation to the way Christians define Jews. And I would like to ask a question about, as Western Europe was emptying out of Jews after 1500, expulsion and so on, and the movement of population was into Poland and into Eastern Europe and so on. Could you comment something about, obviously, part of that process had to be people coming out of Spain. And there's always the question of, I'm Ashkenazi, but I think I have Sephardic roots. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so this question is really about the growth of the Sephardi diaspora as it emerged particularly after 1492. The earliest exiles from the realms of the Catholic monarchs went to Portugal. Right? Thereafter, many went to the most easily available place, North Africa, and several others went to the Italian peninsula. Right? Thereafter, there were several waves, small waves of converso emigration from the peninsula. Many conversos settled in the North Atlantic, in the Netherlands, even in Central Europe, in places like Hamburg. There was a very vast converso diaspora because of mercantile dynamics. And so you had conversos as far east as Nagasaki, let's say, and as far west as New Amsterdam or New York, and of course the Caribbean and so forth. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we have to look at things sequentially, right? There are several exits by Iberian Jews, what are called the Negorashim, right, the expelled ones. And then there are exits of conversos who often join openly Jewish communities elsewhere, or in some cases found their own, established their own Jewish communities where there were none before. So it's a very complex process, and I don't know that I can do it justice in 15 seconds.
Two more questions. We'll do
Yes.
one over here. John, go ahead.
Answer, that was Ron, right? Ron, up there?
Yeah.
We know for sure, genealogically speaking, that certain towns like Damask and Roland, the city charters that are still available said that towns were settled by Sephardic Iberian refugees in the early 1500s. They did not allow Ashkenazim to settle there. There were Sephardic Yiddish in Vienna. They were in Kiev.
Right,
They
sure.
were all over the place. My family's from Mogilev, Belarus. There were 24 Sephardic families there. My family came from Yeda. So we know that there are this is history.
Absolutely. There's no doubt
And
that
DNA is coordinates.
there's no doubt that the Polish magnates and the Polish crown were very interested in creating an artificial middle class where there was none. So it stands to reason that they would invite people who already had the, let's say, the reputation of having international contacts, of being loyal, of being savvy, of being multilingual, and so forth. That, by the way, is one of the main reasons that the Eastern Sephardic diaspora was really such a hub of Sephardic culture, right? That the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan, and his bureaucracy were very keen to utilize the growing Sephardic diaspora and to capitalize on it. Yes.
As sort of a follow-up, but really different, how widely and how quickly did this redefinition of a Jew, this understanding, spread to the Ashkenazic world and to the rest of Jews in the Middle East? And to what extent did it enable Jews to deal with emancipation and the growing secularism that occurred in the 17th and 18th centuries?
Boy, that's a really challenging question. I would say the following, just as an hors d'oeuvre, right? Not as the main course. The nationality that undergirds Jewish culture, including, of course, Sephardi and Ashkenazic variants, was never eliminated. There were ways in which certain rhetorical terms affected immediate outcomes and affected the intellectual life of the Jewish communities for centuries. It's, I think, a matter of, I mean, I could be wrong, but my feeling is that there's a consensus that overall, Sephardic Jews in Central Europe and in Western Europe were much more receptive to the opening of the Enlightenment, for example, to the possibility of emancipation, than their Ashkenazic brethren. I would go so far as to say that Eastern European Jews never lost the ethnic, let's say, the ethnic component as a sort of a primordial bond. So much so that, for example, if an Eastern European Jew became deeply secularized in, let's say, the late 19th century, he or she still spoke Yiddish, and no one around him or her, not Poles, not Lithuanians, not Belarusians, not Moldovans, considered such a person as anything other than a Jew, right? Let's consider for a moment, and this is getting us really into a different territory, that David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, the founding prime minister of Israel, was an atheist. Right? What does that mean? Can you be an atheist and be a Christian at the same time? I doubt it. And of course, this is a figure who was accepted, admired, by many Jews of various backgrounds, both those who took this religious approach, religionizing approach to Jewish life, and those who didn't. The question you asked is monumental, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you all.